Good afternoon, and welcome to the second of 4 U.S. Food and Drug Administration's industry webinars to discuss the infant formula transition plan for exercise of enforcement discretion. Today's webinar will provide more in-depth information about new infant formula submission requirements and recommendations and address questions. I'm Lieutenant Commander Janisha Robbs with the FDA's Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, Communications, and Public Engagement staff. In a moment, I will turn the call over to Dr. Patricia Hansen, Deputy Director of CFSAN's Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling, to provide opening remarks. Then you will hear from Dr. Carrie Assar, Team Leader in CFSAN's Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling, Infant Formula and Medical Food staff, to provide important information on FDA's requirements and recommendations for new infant formula submissions. After the presentation, we will move to the question and answer portion of the call, where Dr. Assar will answer questions we received through the registration process. With that, I will now turn the call over to Dr. Patricia Hansen, Deputy Director of CFSAN's Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling.
Thank you, Janisha, and welcome everyone to the second webinar in this series. As Janisha noted, in this second webinar, Dr. Carrie Assar, Team Leader in our Infant Formula Medical Food staff, will provide you with important information on FDA's requirements and recommendations for new infant formula submissions. As I mentioned in our first webinar, the requirements for new infant formula submissions are the same, whether a manufacturer and its products are eligible to pursue the path outlined in our infant formula transition plan guidance, or a manufacturer is making a new infant formula submission through our regular established process. The substance of most of our recommendations regarding new infant formula submissions will also be the same, regardless of the pathway. I will note there are some process differences, primarily around timing between the two pathways, and Dr. Assar will touch on those as appropriate. We hope that you will find this core information to be helpful, no matter what your role in the development, preparation, or review of the submission for a new infant formula. And now to turn things over to Dr. Assar.
Thank you, Dr. Hansen. Hello, my name is Dr. Carrie Assar. I am the Team Leader for the Infant Formula and Medical Food staff in the Office of Nutrition and Food Labeling. In this webinar, I will be providing information about new infant formula submission requirements and recommendations. In the previous webinar, Dr. Patricia Hansen presented details of the Guidance for Industry Infant Formula Transition Plan for Exercise of Enforcement Discretion. Dr. Hansen covered the phases and timing expectations for action items by covered infant formula manufacturers, addressing both non-exempt and exempt covered infant formulas. The purpose of this presentation is to provide information about new infant formula submission requirements and recommendations for both non-exempt and exempt infant formulas. The new infant formula submission is the manufacturer action item for Phase 5 identified in the transition plan guidance. Non-exempt infant formulas are intended for healthy term infants, and the new infant formula submission requirements are in 21 CFR 106.120. Exempt infant formulas are represented and labeled for use by an infant who has an inborn error of metabolism, low birth weight, or who otherwise has an unusual medical or dietary problem. The terms and conditions for exempt infant formulas, including the infant formula submission requirements, are in 21 CFR 107.50. Before we get into the new infant formula submission, I thought it would be helpful to provide the regulatory definition of a new infant formula. So a new infant formula is an infant formula manufactured by a person that has not previously manufactured infant formula, or a new infant formula is an infant formula manufactured by a person that has previously manufactured infant formula, and there is a major change to the formula. The definition of a major change, as well as some examples, can be found in 106.3. A manufacturer submitting a new infant formula submission for a non-exempt infant formula is required to register the infant formula under 21 CFR 106.110. I want to emphasize that this is registration of the infant formula and is separate from food facility registration requirements. For non-exempt products, the registration information must include the name of the infant formula, the name and address of the manufacturer, and the name and street address of each establishment that participates in the manufacturing of the formula. For example, if you intend on manufacturing the infant formula at facility X and package the formula at facility Y, then both facility X and Y must be included in this registration. We strongly recommend that a manufacturer submitting a new infant formula submission for an exempt infant formula provide the same registration information. Exempt infant formulas provide a critical source of nutrition for an extremely vulnerable segment of the population, and it is important that FDA has information about the formula and the locations of manufacturing. This information is also used to schedule infant formula inspections. So I will begin with the non-exempt new infant formula submission. As I mentioned, the submission requirements are in 21 CFR 106.120. The manufacturer must provide the new infant formula submission to FDA at least 90 days before the new infant formula is introduced or delivered for introduction into interstate commerce. However, under the Infant Formula Transition Plan guidance, FDA will not object to the continued introduction into interstate commerce of a covered infant formula. As Dr. Hansen covered in the previous presentation, the covered manufacturer should submit a letter of intent to FDA, receive an acknowledgement letter, continue to adhere to any steps identified in the firm's letter of enforcement discretion received under the May 2022 guidance, and make meaningful progress towards compliance with applicable regulatory requirements as outlined in the transition plan guidance. So this slide is a very basic overview of the components of a new infant formula submission in 106.120B. The submission components include name and description of the formula, an explanation of why the formula is a new infant formula, quantitative formulation, processing and packaging, assurances related to quality factors and nutrient content, processing assurance and ingredient compliance, and the rationale for the exemption under 21 CFR 106.91 B1II if applicable. I will go into more detail about each of these components in the upcoming slides. For the first component, 106.120B1 requires the manufacturer to provide the name and physical form of the infant formula. Examples of physical forms are powder, concentrated liquid, and ready-to-feed liquid. For the second component, 106.120B2 requires an explanation of why the formula is a new infant formula. For the third component, 106.120B3 requires the quantitative formulation for each form of the infant formula that is the subject of the submission. It also specifies how the ingredient amounts are to be listed for liquid versus powder formulas. For a powder formula, you must also provide the weight of the powder to be reconstituted with a specific volume of water. When there is a reformulation of an infant formula, the manufacturer must include a listing of each new or changed ingredient, as well as a discussion of the effect of the formulation changes on the nutrient levels in the formulation. I want to pause here for a moment to provide a bit more information and clarification about the quantitative formulation because it is often an area of confusion. The quantitative formulation is essentially the recipe for the infant formula. It is a listing of each ingredient with the amount of each ingredient in units per a fixed amount. The full name of the ingredient should be listed, and if a premix or blend is used, the name and amount of each ingredient in the premix or blend should be provided. I've included an example of what a quantitative formulation may look like. This is solely an example for illustrative purposes, and it contains only some ingredients, and the amounts listed are purely hypothetical. I also did not include the weight of the powder to be reconstituted with a specific volume of water. Now, as you can see in the example, the quantitative formulation lists each ingredient in the formula and the amount of each ingredient in units per a fixed amount. In this example, the fixed amount is per 1,000 grams, and each ingredient is listed along with the amount per 1,000 grams. Each ingredient is also listed with its full name. For example, calcium carbonate is listed instead of just calcium. Finally, I included a fat blend listing and the amount used, but beneath the fat blend, each component of the blend is listed as well as the amount. Solely listing fat blend in a quantitative formulation does not provide sufficient information. A similar example is included for a mineral premix. For the fourth component, 106.120b4 requires a description of any change in processing of the infant formula. The description must identify the specific change in processing, including side-by-side detailed schematic diagrams comparing the new processing to the previous processing and processing times and temperatures. Part of the manufacturing of an infant formula includes packaging the product into final containers. So information about product packaging is expected to be included in the new infant formula submission when processing information is provided or if there is a change in packaging. FDA asks manufacturers to submit as much processing information as possible to provide assurance that the infant formula will be manufactured in a manner that prevents adulteration and complies with Part 106. In our experience, questions about processing typically arise during review because this is an important area for preventing adulteration. So we recommend that processing information be provided up front in order to facilitate and streamline submission review. This slide includes a list of the information we recommend you include in the processing component of the submission. A narrative of the entire manufacturing process, processing schematic that includes all processing steps, processing times and temperatures, and hold times and temperatures. If there is a dry blending component of the manufacturing, it is helpful to provide information on the validation of the dry blending step. We also recommend you include allergen control procedures and cleaning sanitation procedures. As I mentioned earlier, part of the manufacturing of an infant formula includes packaging the product into final containers. 21 CFR 106.40b specifies that infant formula containers and closures must not be reactive or absorptive so as to affect the safety of the infant formula. This regulation includes information about substances that may be used as packaging material that comes in contact with infant formula. I'm not going to read all these to you, but rather included this information on the slide for awareness. Some examples of packaging components for infant formula include cans, can ends, liners, peel-off foils, lids, adhesives, and scoops. However, there are also food contact substances that are constituents of packaging. For example, if a colorant is used to make the scoop a specific color, then that colorant is a food contact substance because it comes into contact with the infant formula. I've listed other examples on the slide as well. So what type of information should you include for packaging? In the new infant formula submission, you should provide a summary of packaging information that includes a list of all components of the packaging along with the full chemical identity for each component with the CAS registry number, and a summary of any changes made to packaging components if applicable. You should also include declarations of compliance from each packaging manufacturer and/or supplier that certify each component of the packaging is authorized for specific use. The declarations of compliance should include the following information for each component of the packaging: the full chemical identity, including CAS registry number, the intended use, and the regulatory status or how each component is authorized for its specific intended use. This slide includes an example of the information that should be included for each packaging component. The fifth component of the new infant formula submission is 106.120B5, which requires assurance that the infant formula will not be marketed unless it meets the requirements for quality factors and nutrient content. I'm going to cover the first part of this component, highlighted in blue text, which is the requirement to provide assurance that the infant formula meets the quality factors in 106.96 in a submission that complies with 106.121. Before we talk more about the required assurance, I thought it would be helpful to define quality factors and identify what they are. Quality factors are defined as those factors necessary to demonstrate the safety of the infant formula and the bioavailability of its nutrients, as prepared for market and when fed as the sole source of nutrition, to ensure the healthy growth of infants. Section 412 of the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, also known as the Infant Formula Act, created a statutory mandate for the Secretary of Health and Human Services, and by delegation FDA, to establish requirements for quality factors for infant formulas. The Infant Formula Final Rule, published in 2014, identifies two infant formula quality factors. They are sufficient biological quality of protein and normal physical growth. 106.96E requires that an infant formula meets the quality factor of sufficient biological quality of protein. It is important to note that this regulation states the infant formula must meet this quality factor and not just the individual proteins. Protein quality depends on a number of factors and complex interactions, including differences in the digestibility of proteins from different sources, as well as the processing method of the formula. Therefore, this quality factor was established for the protein within the infant formula matrix. 10696F states that a manufacturer must demonstrate that an infant formula meets this quality factor by establishing the biological quality of the protein in the infant formula when fed as the sole source of nutrition using an appropriate modification of the protein efficiency ratio, or PER, rat bioassay. This bioassay is an AOAC official method, and FDA describes the appropriate modifications in the preamble of the Infant Formula Interim Final Rule. The modifications, as well as more details about the PER bioassay, will be covered in the next webinar in this series. The final bullet on this slide is important to note. This regulation also requires the manufacturer to conduct the PER bioassay and evaluate the results before initiation of the growth monitoring study, which is a clinical study conducted to meet the quality factor of normal physical growth. Unless a manufacturer is requesting an exemption from the requirement to conduct a PER rat bioassay, the results of the bioassay study must be included in the new infant formula submission. Including the PER study final report in the submission is the ideal route to provide the study results. The specific components that we recommend be included in that final report will be discussed in the next webinar on the quality factor of sufficient biological quality of protein. We also suggest including the study protocol in the submission to expedite FDA review. Prior to conducting a PER rat bioassay, we strongly recommend manufacturers request FDA feedback on the draft protocol. In fact, the transition plan guidance anticipates that a covered manufacturer who intends to conduct a PER rat bioassay using a covered infant formula will provide the draft protocol to FDA for review as part of Phase 2 in the guidance. If a covered manufacturer intends to utilize one of the exemptions in the regulations, The applicable information should be provided to FDA as outlined in phases 2 and 3 in the guidance. Okay. 10696 also includes exemptions that a manufacturer may request for different circumstances and identifies the associated regulation in 106.121 that describes the information that must be included in the infant formula submission for the exemption. It is the manufacturer's obligation to establish that all the conditions of the requested exemption are satisfied. In 10696G1, a manufacturer may request an exemption from the requirement to conduct a PER rat bioassay when changes made by the manufacturer to an existing formula are limited to changing the type of packaging of an existing infant formula. For example, changing from metal cans to plastic pouches. This exemption is only applicable to a change in packaging for an existing formula. The associated regulation in 106.121G states that the manufacturer must include a detailed description of the packaging change and an explanation of why the change satisfies the exemption criteria. FDA views an existing infant formula as an infant formula previously notified to FDA for the U.S. market by the same manufacturer requesting the exemption in the new infant formula submission. In 106.96G2, a manufacturer may request this exemption if it demonstrates that a change made by the manufacturer to an existing formula does not affect the quality or the bioavailability of the protein. This exemption is only applicable for a change to an existing formula, which is typically formulation or processing changes that do not have the potential to affect the biological quality of the protein in the infant formula. The associated regulation in 106.121H states that the manufacturer must include a detailed description of the change made to the existing formula and an explanation why the change does not affect the bioavailability of the protein. In 106.96G3, a manufacturer may request an exemption to use an alternative method to the PER rat bioassay that is based on sound scientific principles to demonstrate that the infant formula meets the quality factor of sufficient biological quality of protein. I want to emphasize that with this exemption, the alternative method must be able to demonstrate the infant formula and not just the individual proteins meets this quality factor. The associated regulation in 106.121I states that the manufacturer must include a detailed explanation of the alternative method, an explanation of why the method is based on sound scientific principles, and the data that demonstrate that the quality factor has been met. So now we'll move on to the next quality factor. 106.96A requires that an infant formula meet the quality factor of normal physical growth. To establish that an infant formula supports normal physical growth when fed as a sole source of nutrition, 106.96B requires that a manufacturer conduct, in accordance with good clinical practice, an adequate and well-controlled growth monitoring study, or GMS, of the infant formula. Prior to conducting the growth monitoring study, we strongly recommend manufacturers request FDA feedback on the draft protocol, statistical analysis plan, and any other associated study materials. As mentioned in the previous webinar, a covered manufacturer that intends to conduct a GMS using a covered infant formula should provide a statement of intent in Phase 2 and the draft study protocol in Phase 3 to FDA per the transition plan guidance. If a covered manufacturer intends to utilize one of the exemptions in the regulations, the applicable information should be provided to FDA as outlined in Phases 2 and 3 of the guidance. If you are conducting a growth monitoring study, the minimum requirements for the study are specified in 106.96b. The GMS will be covered in much more detail in the webinar on the quality factor of normal physical growth. However, I've provided a summary of the study requirements on this slide for your awareness. If you conduct a growth monitoring study under 106.96b, the new infant formula submission requirements for the GMS are in 106.121a. This regulation requires a manufacturer to submit certain data and information that are required to be collected during the GMS and that are necessary to assess whether the infant formula supports normal physical growth. I am going to go through the specific regulatory requirements listed in 106.121a. So the new infant formula submission must include an explanation in narrative form describing how the requirements in 106.96b have been met. Providing the study protocol, statistical analysis plan, and final clinical study report are useful for meeting this requirement. Records must also be submitted that contain the information required by 106.96b to be collected during the study for each infant enrolled in the study. The records must be identified by subject number, age, feeding group, sex, and study day of collection. The manufacturer must provide the study data, which includes the raw study data, in the new infant formula submission. The manufacturer must also include statistical evaluation for all measurements, including group means, group standard deviations, and measures of statistical significance for all measurements for each feeding group at the beginning of the study and at every point where measurements were made throughout the study. Calculations of the statistical power of the study before study initiation and at study completion must also be provided. The new infant formula submission must also include a report on attrition and on all occurrences of adverse events during the study. This report must include the following: identification of the infant by subject number and feeding group, and a complete description of the adverse event, including comparisons of the frequency and nature of occurrence in each feeding group, and information on the health of the infant during the course of the study, including the occurrence and duration of any illness. A clinical assessment by a healthcare provider of the infant's health during each suspected adverse event, and a list of all subjects who did not complete the study, including the subject number and the reason that each subject did not complete the study. We recommend including any additional information related to the GMS that will help expedite FDA review. For example, it is helpful to provide examples of case report forms, formula intake record forms, questionnaires, and study staff training materials used during the GMS. If not already included as part of 106.121A1, submitting the IRB-approved study protocol and statistical analysis plan will help facilitate FDA review. The FDA recognizes that not every change to an infant formula necessitates a new clinical study. So several exemptions from the requirement to conduct a GMS are available in the regulations for changes to an existing formula when the change does not negatively impact the bioavailability of the formula, or when the manufacturer markets the formula in more than one form. In addition, there is an exemption for a manufacturer to demonstrate that an alternative study design or method would provide assurance that an infant formula supports normal physical growth. These exemptions are in 106.96c, and I will go through them individually, as well as the associated regulation in 106.121 that describes the information that must be included in the submission for that specific exemption. Again, it is the manufacturer's obligation to establish that all the conditions of the requested exemption are satisfied. A manufacturer may request this exemption under 106.96C1 when changes made by the manufacturer to an existing infant formula are limited to changing the type of packaging of an existing infant formula. The associated regulation in 106.121B states that the manufacturer must include a detailed description of the change and an explanation why the change made to an existing formula satisfies the exemption criteria. A manufacturer may request an exemption under 106.96C2I to demonstrate that an alternative method or study design that is based on sound scientific principles is available to show that the formula supports normal physical growth when fed as the sole source of nutrition. The associated regulation in 106.121C states that the manufacturer must include a description of the alternative method or study design, an explanation of why the method or study design is based on sound scientific principles, and data that demonstrate the formula supports normal physical growth in infants when fed as the sole source of nutrition. A manufacturer may request an exemption under 106.96C2II when a change made to an existing formula, such as in formulation or processing, does not affect the ability of the formula to support normal physical growth. As I mentioned earlier, FDA views an existing infant formula as an infant formula previously notified to FDA for the U.S. market by the same manufacturer requesting the exemption in the new infant formula submission. The associated regulation in 106.121D states that the manufacturer must include a description of the change and an explanation of why the change made by the manufacturer to an existing infant formula does not affect the ability of the formula to support normal physical growth. A manufacturer may request an exemption under 106.96C2II when it markets a formulation in more than one form, such as liquid and powder, and the quality factor requirements are met by the form that is processed using the method that has the greatest potential for adversely affecting nutrient content and bioavailability. It is typically the manufacturing of liquid infant formulas that have the greatest potential for adversely affecting nutrients and/or bioavailability. The associated regulation in 106.121E states that the manufacturer must include a detailed description of the two formulations and an explanation of why the quality factor requirement of normal physical growth is met by the form of the formula that is processed using the method that has the greatest potential for adversely affecting nutrient content and bioavailability. The last part of the submission component related to the quality factors is the certification statement identified in 106.121J. This regulation states that the manufacturer must submit a statement certifying that the manufacturer has collected and considered all information and data concerning the ability of the infant formula to meet the requirements for quality factors, and that the manufacturer is not aware of any information or data that would show that the formula does not meet the requirements for quality factors. The other piece of the fifth submission component, which is highlighted in blue text, is assurance that the formula complies with the nutrient requirements in 21 CFR 107.100. The manufacturer must provide a statement that the formula will not be marketed unless it meets the nutrient requirements of 107.100, as demonstrated by testing required under 21 CFR 106 subpart C. The sixth new infant formula submission component is 106.120B6 and is related to processing assurance and ingredient compliance. This regulation requires a manufacturer to provide assurance that the processing of the infant formula complies with Section 412(b)(2) of the FD&C Act. This assurance is comprised of two parts. The first is a statement indicating that the formula will be produced in accordance with subparts B and C of 21 CFR 106. Subpart B includes the regulations for current good manufacturing practices, and Subpart C includes regulations for quality control procedures. The second part is related to the regulatory status of the ingredients in the infant formula. This regulation requires the manufacturer to provide the basis for how each ingredient meets the requirements in 106.40A, which I will go over in the next slide. The 106.40A states that the only substances that may be used in an infant formula are substances that are safe and suitable for use in infant formula under the applicable food safety provisions of the FD&C Act. That is, a substance is used in accordance with FDA's food additive regulations, is generally recognized as safe or GRAS for use in infant formula, or is authorized by a prior sanction. I emphasize the part about GRAS for use in infant formula because if an ingredient is GRAS for use in baked goods, for example, that does not mean it is GRAS for use in infant formula. So a straightforward way to provide the basis for how each ingredient meets the requirements in 106.40A is by using a table with each ingredient in one column and the corresponding basis in the next column. Examples of appropriate information to include as the basis for an ingredient meeting 106.40A includes citation to an applicable food additive or GRAS regulation, and citation to a GRAS notice for a specific ingredient or use in infant formula. If the ingredient in your infant formula is from a different supplier than specified in the cited GRAS notice, then we will ask for additional information that demonstrates the ingredient has the same intended use and use level, specifications, and manufacturing method as the ingredient in the GRAS notice. I've also provided examples of information that we consider not sufficient to meet 106.40A. Citation to a food additive regulation or GRAS regulation for animal products is not sufficient because the intended uses are for animals and do not include infant formula. Citation to a standard of identity regulation is something we see quite a bit, but it is not sufficient to meet this requirement. Standard of identity regulations describe in detail what a food product must contain, how it must be proportioned, and sometimes how it is manufactured. These regulations do not provide information about the safe use of the food product in infant formula. Furthermore, a link to FDA's Global Substance Registration System for an ingredient is not sufficient because it does not provide information about the safe use of the ingredient in infant formula. The last and seventh component of a new infant formula submission is listed in 106.120B7 and is only included in a submission when applicable. This regulation applies when a manufacturer is requesting an exemption under 106.91B1II, which is an exemption from certain nutrient testing requirements for the first production aggregate of a new infant formula. I will not go into detail about this exemption, but I have included information on the slide for your awareness. Although not required by regulation, we strongly encourage including the product label, the use by date information, and stability data for the infant formula. Submitting a copy of the product label will allow FDA to provide feedback on the label before the product is in the market when it is much more difficult to make changes. The label review includes a review of claims as well as technical aspects of the label. After submitting a new infant formula submission to FDA, we will conduct an initial evaluation for completeness. A submission will not constitute notice under Section 412 of the FD&C Act unless it complies fully with 106.120B as applicable, and the information it contains is readily understandable. We will notify the manufacturer if a submission is not complete or not readily understandable. If a new infant formula submission is complete, we will acknowledge its receipt and notify the manufacturer of the date of receipt. The date that FDA receives a new infant formula submission that is complete is the filing date for the submission. So let's move on to the new infant formula submission for exempt infant formula. As I mentioned at the beginning of the webinar, an exempt infant formula is an infant formula that is represented and labeled for use by an infant who has an inborn error of metabolism or low birth weight, or who otherwise has an unusual medical or dietary problem. The terms and conditions for exempt infant formulas, including the submission requirements, are in 21 CFR 107.50, which is Subpart C of Part 107. Subpart C breaks exempt infant formulas into two categories based on their availability to consumers. Infant formulas generally available at retail and infant formulas not generally available at retail. However, the new infant formula submission requirements are the same for both categories and are in 107.50B3. So a manufacturer must submit the new infant formula submission for an exempt infant formula to FDA on or before the 90th day before the first processing of the infant formula for commercial or charitable distribution. However, just as with non-exempt infant formulas, under the Infant Formula Transition Plan guidance, a covered infant formula manufacturer may continue to introduce its covered exempt infant formula into interstate commerce under enforcement discretion while the guidance is in effect. For a new infant formula submission for an exempt formula, 107.50B3 requires the manufacturer to submit the label and other labeling of the infant formula, a complete quantitative formulation, and a detailed description of the medical conditions for which the formula is represented. In the new infant formula submission, the manufacturer must provide the product label as well as the labeling. The FD&C Act defines labeling as all labels and other written, printed, or graphic matter upon any article or any of its containers or wrappers or accompanying such article. The term accompanying is more than physical association with the product. Labeling may also include, for example, websites, brochures, instruction sheets, and healthcare provider information. I covered the quantitative formulation in a slide in the non-exempt submission section for the third component. As a brief recap, the quantitative formulation is the recipe for the infant formula. It should list each ingredient with the amount of each ingredient in units per a fixed amount, the full name of each ingredient, and if a premix or blend is used, the name and amount of each component of that premix or blend. In addition to the required detailed description of the medical conditions for which the infant formula is represented, you should include the scientific basis to support the medical condition. The scientific basis is the data and information you are relying upon to demonstrate that the infant formula provides the appropriate nutritional support and is safe for the intended population. Clinical studies are frequently submitted to FDA as part of the scientific basis to support a medical condition. One example of a clinical study that is often submitted for hypoallergenic infant formula is a clinical study that follows study recommendations published by the American Academy of Pediatrics. Now, due to the variety of products in the exempt infant formula category, as well as the diversity of medical conditions, There is no one-size-fits-all approach to studies for this category of infant formula. We strongly recommend that a manufacturer who intends to conduct a clinical study to support the medical condition of an exempt infant formula request FDA feedback on the study protocol and statistical analysis plan. So exempt infant formulas may need to differ from non-exempt infant formulas in order to provide adequate nutrition for infants who consume the formulas for a specific medical or dietary purpose. For example, the nutrient content may need to differ from what is specified in 107.100 due to the specific medical condition for which the exempt infant formula is labeled. For this reason, the exempt infant formula regulations allow for deviation from nutrient and labeling requirements. If deviation from specific nutrient and/or labeling requirements is needed for an exempt infant formula, the manufacturer must submit to FDA the medical, nutritional, scientific, or technological rationale, including any appropriate animal or human clinical studies, to support that deviation. We also ask manufacturers to include processing and packaging information, which were discussed earlier in the non-exempt submission section. This information is critical for FDA review and to provide assurance that the formula will be manufactured and packaged in a manner to prevent adulteration. Going back to the hypoallergenic exempt infant formula example, we would ask the manufacturer to provide information on allergen control, allergen testing, and prevention of cross-contamination to support assurance that the formula is in fact hypoallergenic. Including use-by date information and stability data in the submission is also encouraged. So in closing, the infant formula transition plan guidance describes the actions a covered infant formula manufacturer should take if it wishes to have FDA consider continued exercise of enforcement discretion while the guidance is in effect. The guidance identifies the manufacturer action items and information that should be provided to FDA during each phase, including study protocols and outlines of exemption requests. Additionally, we encourage all infant formula manufacturers to become thoroughly knowledgeable of the regulations in 21 CFR 106 and 107. The preambles of the infant formula interim final rule and infant formula final rule contain a great deal of helpful information related not just to infant formula submissions, but all of Part 106. The next slide contains links to the preambles. For manufacturers intending to pursue a new infant formula submission outside of the transition plan guidance, FDA strongly encourages those manufacturers to request FDA feedback on PER rat bioassay and GMS protocols, any protocol for an alternative study design, the applicability of a specific quality factor exemption request, and study protocols for exempt infant formulas. Okay. So this is the slide with links to resources, including the preambles that I mentioned earlier. Thank you for your time.
Thank you, Dr. Assar. At this time, we will begin the question and answer portion of the webinar. During the webinar registration process, we received several questions related to quality factors and exemptions from some of the relevant regulatory requirements. Stakeholders asked for more clarity on criteria the agency would use or if consideration would be case by case, and also asked for clarification on certain items described in the infant formula transition plan guidance. Here's our first question. I would like to understand more about how the agency plans to consider exemptions from the quality control factors for clinical growth studies and PER studies. Are there criteria the agency will use and that could provide companies some guidance as they make decisions on how and whether to proceed, or will it be case by case?
First, I'd like to clarify that FDA is not exempting any infant formula manufacturers from meeting the quality factor requirements for infant formula, namely sufficient biological quality of protein and normal physical growth. As I mentioned in the presentation, our regulations identify and describe the studies generally needed to meet those quality factors: the protein efficiency ratio, or PER, rat bioassay, and the growth monitoring study, or GMS, respectively. Also, as previously mentioned, our regulations provide some limited exemptions from conducting those studies. For example, the regulation 21 CFR 106.96 G1 provides an exemption from conducting a PER rat bioassay when a manufacturer's changes to an existing notified formula are limited to the changing the type of packaging of the existing infant formula. The manufacturer needs to request that specific exemption and provide a detailed explanation of the change, as well as an explanation of how the change satisfies the conditions specified in the regulations. As a reminder, FDA views an existing infant formula as an infant formula previously notified to FDA for the U.S. market by the same manufacturer requesting the exemption in the new infant formula submission.
Can the agency provide more clarity to manufacturers seeking a modification or deviation for the demonstration of sufficient biological quality of protein through the PER rat bioassay? The transition plan guidance calls for a draft narrative explanation of why data and information demonstrate that the quality factor of sufficient biological quality of protein is met, see 21 CFR 106.96 G1 and G2, along with the data relied on and copies of additional studies cited in support. What information is the agency seeking in the draft narrative to support a modification deviation from the need to conduct a PER rat bioassay?
As noted in the presentation, for a request for an exemption from the requirement to conduct a PER under 21 CFR 106.96 G1, which is a change in packaging, or G2, other change not affecting the bioavailability of protein, the manufacturer needs to request the specific exemption in the new infant formula submission, provide a detailed description of the change to an existing notified infant formula, and include the information specified in the applicable regulations. For the draft narrative explanation described in the transition plan guidance in phase 3 for non-exempt formulas, what we are looking for is identification of the specific exemption that the covered manufacturer intends to request, so 106.96 G1 or G2, and a draft written detailed explanation of how the change to the existing notified formula satisfies the conditions specified in the applicable section of the regulations. That is 106.96 G1 or G2, and any other regulations cited, such as those in 106.121. The explanation should include any data the manufacturer is relying on to support the exemption, as well as copies of additional studies cited as applicable. As Dr. Hansen indicated in the first webinar in this series, we will review this information and provide the manufacturer with their feedback in writing and/or in a meeting.
Our next question: can the agency provide more clarity to manufacturers seeking a modification or deviation for establishing that the quality factor of normal physical growth, 21 CFR 106.96A, is met by conducting a growth monitoring study under 21 CFR 106.96B? The transition plan guidance allows for a statement that the manufacturer otherwise intends to request an exemption from the requirements of 21 CFR 106.96B under 21 CFR 106.96 C1, C2 Part 2, or C2 Part 3. What information is the agency seeking in the statement that would support such an exemption for conducting a GMS under 21 CFR 106.96B?
As noted in the presentation, for a request for an exemption from the requirement to conduct a growth monitoring study, or GMS, under 21 CFR 106.96C1 for a change in packaging, C2II for other types of changes, or C2III for different forms of the formula, the manufacturer needs to request a specific exemption in the new infant formula submission and provide the information specified in the applicable regulations. What we are looking for in the statement described in the transition plan guidance in Phase 2 for non-exempt formulas is simply a written statement by the covered manufacturer identifying the specific exemption they intend to request, the 106.96C1, C2II, or C2III, if in fact it plans to request one. As Dr. Hansen indicated in the first webinar and as described in the transition plan guidance, to help manufacturers prepare the information FDA anticipates receiving in Phase 2, we intend to begin meeting with covered infant formula manufacturers to discuss, among other things, whether a manufacturer intends to comply with the requirement to conduct a GMS per our regulations in 21 CFR 106.96B, or whether the manufacturer intends to request an exemption from this requirement. Manufacturers can use these meetings to, among other things, present any questions they may have regarding requirements for new infant formula submissions, including requests for exemptions from certain requirements.
Great. Thank you, Dr. Assar. As a reminder, the next webinar in the series is November 10th at 2 p.m., and it will focus on the quality factor requirement, sufficient biological quality of protein. If you haven't already, please register to attend the webinar series. For your convenience, the registration link to the webinar series is located in the YouTube description box below. One registration provides access to all webinars. This concludes today's webinar. A recording will be available shortly on FDA's Meeting webpage. Thank you and goodbye.